Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome to today's reading from Brilliant as the Sun, a retelling of Srimad Bhagavatam. We're reading from Canto 6, Divine Protection. Chapter 1. The Yamaduta sees Ajamil. Mukam karoti vachalam pangum langhayate girim yat kripa tambham vande Shri Gurum Deenatarinam Paramananda Madhavam Shri Chaitanya Ishwaram Hari Om Tat Sat. Verse 34. The three Yamadutas stared with gaping mouths at the intruders. They had seen no one so beautiful. The four dazzling personalities had eyes shaped like lotus petals. They appeared fresh and youthful, wearing yellow silk garments, attractive helmets and earrings and lotus garlands. Each of them had 4 long arms, and they held bows and arrows, swords, clubs, conch shells, discs and lotus flowers. The second Yamaduta said, "Who are you? Your personal effulgence has dissipated the darkness here with extraordinary illumination." The first Yamaduta spoke again. "Tell us, sirs, why are you obstructing us?" Verses 37 to 39 now. The 4 shining figures lowered their weapons and smiled in voices like rumbling clouds. They each spoke in turn. "We are Vishnudutas, servants of Lord Vishnu," said the first one. "If you are actually Yamraja's servants, explain to us the meaning of religious principles and the characteristics of irreligion." "What is the process of punishing others?" asked the second. "Who is worthy of punishment? Are all materialists punishable or just some of them?" said the third. Verse 40. The Yamadutas looked at each other in confusion. They had never encountered such a situation before. Finally, one of them spoke up. "Whatever is prescribed in the Vedas is religion. The opposite of that is irreligion." Another of them said, "Yes, the Vedas are important because they are actually Lord Narayan." The third said, "I know it's hard to understand, but it's true. Yamaraj told us, he said the Vedas are Narayan's breath." The Vishnuduta smiled approvingly. "What else has he taught you?" Verse 41. The Yamadutas looked at one another and then one said, "The supreme cause of all causes is Narayan. He lives in his own abode, the spiritual world, but he controls the material world through the 3 modes of nature. Through the agency of these modes, the living entities receive various bodies with distinct qualities. People have different natures depending on whether they are Brahmin, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas or Shudras. By Narayan's decree, they each have their specific duty in society." One of the Vishnudutas said, "Who ensures they are properly doing their duties?" Verses 42 and 43. Another Yamaduta spoke. "The sun, fire, sky, air, gods, moon, evening, day, night, directions, water, land, and the Supersoul himself are all witnesses to the living entities' activities. When all these witnesses concur that someone has deviated from their prescribed duties, then Yamaraj sends us to punish them." You asked who should be punished. The answer is anyone engaged in selfish enjoyment rather than satisfying Narayan. Verse 44. The third Yamaduta said, "Clearly you are all sinless, but the souls in the material world are not like you. They are all selfishly motivated and thus under the control of material nature. They cannot refrain from action, and influenced by the modes of nature, they will inevitably commit sin. Therefore, at some point or other, everyone in the material world falls into hell." A Vishnuduta said, "Why do the modes force them to sin?" Verse 45. The Yamaduta said, frowned in thought. No one had ever interrogated them in this way. Then one said, "The 3 material modes compete depending on what proportion of a person's conduct is in the mode of goodness, passion and ignorance. They will enjoy or suffer the commensurate karmic reactions in the next life." One of the Vishnudutas asked, "How can you tell which mode is controlling someone?" Verse 46. A Yamaduta replied, "You are surely the best of the gods, so you must know these things. But since you are asking us, we shall do our best to answer. In our experience, a person predominantly in the mode of goodness is peaceful and happy. This is because he follows scriptural regulations. Those influenced by passion are restless, sometimes happy and sometimes not. This is because they only partially follow scripture. Those in the mode of ignorance foolishly ignore scripture and are unhappy. If someone is predominantly in a particular mode in this life, that mode will continue to be their primary influence in the next life. Verse 47, our master Yamaraj used an analogy to explain this to us. He said that by observing springtime now, we can tell the nature of previous and future springs. Similarly, by observing how happy or unhappy someone is in the present life, we can tell the type of person they were in the past life and the life they will have next. A Vishnuduta said, is that how Yamaraj decides who to punish? Verse 48, one of the Yamadutas exclaimed, oh no, our master Yamaraj is omnipotent like Lord Brahma. By the grace of the Supersoul, he can see everyone's past, present. He knows exactly how they will act in future lives. Why do the living entities not try to improve themselves so their future will be better? Verse 49, the Yamadutas looked at each other and shrugged. One said, because they are ignorant of their past and blind to their future lives, just as a sleeping man cannot remember anything of his waking life. The mode of ignorance makes people identify with whatever body they occupy. Everyone thinks their present body is all in all, without consideration of the past or future. Verse 50, another Yamaduta said, the problem is that each living entity engages his senses to enjoy the objects of this world. There are 11 senses, including the mind, and 5 sense objects. The soul who differs from these struggles alone to enjoy in this world. He sometimes experiences happiness, sometimes misery, and sometimes a mixture of both. Why do the living entities act like this? Asked one of the Vishnudutas. Verse 51, the Yamadutas stood in silent thought for a moment, then one said, because they carry insurmountable powerful desires in their subtle body, which is made from the modes of nature. These desires impel the living entities to travel from one body to another. Sometimes they get the form of a god, and sometimes they become jubilant. Other times they get a human body in which they constantly lament, and sometimes they receive an animal body in which they are always afraid. I'll repeat. Sometimes they get the form of a god and become jubilant. Other times they get a human body in which they constantly lament. And sometimes they receive an animal body in which they are always afraid. As long as the living entity continues transmigrating from one body to another, he suffers. Verse 52, the third Yamaduta added, even if he wants to get out of the cycle of birth and death, he does not know how. Just as a silkworm is trapped by the cocoon it makes, the living entity is trapped by his own karmic reactions. Thus the modes of nature impel him to continuously fulfill the urges of his mind and senses. Surely gods and humans can check their own behavior, said a Vishnuduta. Verse 53, the Yamadutas shook their heads in unison. No conditioned soul can check himself. Nature's 3 modes force them all to act. One of the Vishnudutas said, why do the living entities get such different bodies? Verse 54, the Yamadutas frowned in thought. These Vishnudutas were asking hard questions. After some moments, one of them said, the different desires people harbor in their mind carry them into their next gross bodies. The reason for their current desires is their actions in their previous life. Conditioned souls do not understand the connection between their actions and their desires, nor do they understand how their desires determine their next life. A person's family, their gender, and everything else is determined by the desires when he left his previous body. So conditioned souls do not understand the connection between their actions and their desires, nor do they understand how their desires determine their next life. A person's family, their gender, and everything else is determined by his desires when he left his previous body. Verse 55, the Yamadutas stared blankly at each other. Finally, one said, this is verse 55, finally one said, once the soul is entangled in matter, it is very difficult to get out. But we have heard that there is one way, and that is if he learns how to associate with the Supreme Lord or his devotee. Only then can the conditioned soul attain liberation. Was Ajamil taught this? Verses 56 and 57, the Yamadutas nodded with sullen expressions. One said, in his early years, Ajamil seemed well positioned for liberation. He studied the Vedas and was a reservoir of excellent character and behavior. He was gentle and controlled his mind and senses. He knew how to chant Vedic mantras and was pure in heart, respectful to his spiritual master, the fire god, guests, and the elderly. Indeed, he was free from false prestige, righteous, benevolent to all creatures, without envy, and altogether well behaved. Verses 58 and to 60. However, he changed after a particular incident. His father asked him to collect fruits, flowers, and sacred grass to be used in Narayan's worship. On his way home from the forest, he chanced upon a low-class man shamelessly embracing a prostitute. They were both drunk, laughing and singing. The woman's dress was loose, revealing a body. Verses 61 and 62, when Ajamil saw the man embracing the prostitute, his own dormant, lusty desires awakened, and he took control of his mind. Recalling the instructions of the Vedas not to see such things, he tried to look away, but it was too late. He could not restrain himself. Verses 63 to 65, another Yamaduta said, in the same way that a low planet eclipses the sun and moon, the lusty display covered this Brahman's moral sense. After this, he could not stop thinking of her, and within a short time abandoned his religious duties and brought her to his house. It was all downhill for him after that. He spent all his inheritance on her, and giving up all religious duties, he did whatever she wanted, no matter how sinful. He even rejected his young and faithful wife. Verses 66 and 67. He was born in a Brahmin family and had a good start to life, but after taking in the prostitute, he became most sinful. He took to criminal means to get money, lived extravagantly, ate forbidden foods, and engaged in unclean, forbidden acts. Last verse of this chapter, verse 68, the third Yamaduta pulled on the rope around Ajamil's neck and growled, since he has not in any way atoned for his sins, we must now take him to Yamaraj for punishment and purify him of his many sins. So this concludes the first chapter, and we'll continue with the second chapter next time. Ajamil saved by Vishnu's messengers. Thank you for joining. Hari Om Tat Sat. Hare Krishna.